I've been thinking a lot about how we talk about mental health in the workplace. Being a mom of twins while running this podcast has really opened my eyes to something recently. I hit a wall trying to juggle the demands of motherhood, keeping up with recordings, working, and maintaining that work-life balance that I'm pretty much always preaching about. And between the responsibilities of being a working mom and my packed days, my focus honestly was just scattered. My sleep wasn't super great, and I felt like I was just getting by. That experience led me to discover this concept of mental wealth, and it's completely shifted how I think about workplace wellness. Instead of just managing mental health reactively, mental wealth is about proactively investing in your mental resilience. Think of it like building a mental savings account that you can draw from when work gets challenging. I've been exploring different tools and habits that support this mental wealth building, and I recently discovered something that's become a game changer in my daily routine. Magic Mind reached out and sent me their mental performance shots and sleep elixir to try, and what caught my attention was how they align with the 5 pillars of mental wealth: sleep, diet, exercise, stress management, and what they call exogenous compounds. Basically, the supplemental tools that help optimize your mental state. So here's what's fascinating. They've created this 24-hour approach to mental performance. The daytime shot helps with focus and clarity, and I've been using this for my morning podcast recordings, and I've noticed that I am much sharper and much more present in my interviews. And then their sleep elixir helps you wind down and get better rest, which we know is crucial for making good decisions, especially in HR. And I should mention, I only take vitamins. I'm not someone who generally relies on or frankly even believes in other kinds of supplements, but Magic Mind has actually made an impact on me. And in fact, I didn't agree to working with them until I had the opportunity to truly test its efficacy. And I've done that. And plus, Magic Mind is vegan friendly. So for someone like me who keeps kosher, this was really important. And what I appreciate is that they're not positioning this as some miracle cure. It's one piece of a larger mental wealth strategy. The formula includes time-released caffeine to avoid that dreaded afternoon crash, and they've added specific herbs for stress reduction, which is honestly something we could all use more of in HR. Plus, it doesn't replace your regular caffeine routine, thank goodness, so I drink the mental performance shot alongside my morning coffee. And for my listeners who also want to invest in their mental wealth this January, Magic Mind is offering an exclusive 45% off their new bundle pack, both the focus and sleep shots together. Just go to magicmind.com/humanhrjan. That's magicmind.com/humanhrjan for 45% off your first bundle. Make 2025 the year you truly invest in your mental resilience. Your team and your career will thank you for it. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Appreciate you being here for another episode. And it is officially 2025 by the time this episode comes out. So happy new year to everybody. If I didn't say it on the episode before, depending on when this one comes out. But I want to introduce you to a very special guest because we are going to be talking about a very special and important topic today. And with me, I have Kate Isichei, who is a neuro-inclusion consultant. She helps recruiters, HR, and people managers to build neuro-inclusive cultures to harness the skills and talents of neurodivergent candidates and existing employees. Her journey in neuro-inclusion began 4 years ago when her own children were diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And the advice given to her was to go away and become an expert, which, by the way, is not helpful at all on neurodivergence. And what she's come to learn is that the various neurotypes represented by autism, ADHD, offer so many untapped skills and knowledge and innovative ways of thinking. How often does this go to waste in companies and organizations across the globe? How can we begin harnessing the rich landscapes of different ideas and problem solving that neurodivergent employees offer? And how can we create cultures that are more neuro-inclusive? These are the problems that she helps companies to solve. So Kate, thank you so much for sharing your story so vulnerably and transparently. And thank you for taking that advice and running with it. Although it's probably not so helpful to be told that, it helps us because you have actually become an expert in this.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Tracy. I'm really very honoured to be on the podcast. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you for the summary because that's exactly what I do. I've used all of that knowledge and research to help organisations to become more neuro-inclusive, and it really starts with understanding. And if people have a basic awareness and understanding, then it's a really good start to helping existing neurodivergent people in the companies to feel more comfortable and to thrive.
Yeah, that's so well said. And, something that I've been reflecting on, and I talked about this quite a bit in, the last year. Obviously, we're still recording in 2024, but by the time folks hear this, it's already the new year. And so last year, I spent quite a bit of time talking about what equity means, what inclusivity means, what diversity means. And sometimes we really just boil it down to the way people look. But the thing is that neurodivergence you can't always see. And I, as an employer and as someone who works with people who are neurodivergent and really I would say I try to foster an inclusive and equitable and environment. I think about all of the people who potentially are neurodivergent who have not shared that, who maybe haven't even been diagnosed with neurodivergent diagnoses, right? And all of these things come to mind. And really, something that has stood out to me in these last few weeks in preparing for our conversation is that I think sometimes people talk about neurodivergence as if there isn't any neurodivergence in their company already. And it's
So,
always like this thing to prepare for. How, it's like, who are those people? But it's like, you have hundreds of people in your organization. Chances are you've got someone, right?
exactly. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And it is always seen as this other world, almost like the Lord of the Rings, this sort of never far away Neverland where, people exist who don't integrate into society. But of course, you're 100% right. We're integrated into society. I count myself as neurodivergent, although I'm not diagnosed. And there are so many people in society who've self-diagnosed because they can't
Mhm.
stand, waiting on a 10-year list to receive a formal diagnosis. Lots of children are being diagnosed, but adults are really struggling to get that diagnosis because the, healthcare system, at least in the UK, doesn't prioritize them. So
Mm.
yeah, they're
Mhm.
already there. I mean, it's estimated that 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent. And, we're talking here not just about autism and ADHD, but dyslexia, dyspraxia,
Mhm.
dyscalculia. There are many conditions that
Mhm.
fit under that neurodivergent label, but the vast majority, has to be said, are autistic. It's about 7%.
Wow. Wow. It's helpful to hear this. And it brings me to your white paper, which I do have up in front of me because you've done quite a bit of research, as you mentioned, into these topics. And something that stood out to me, it's actually only in the beginning, it's on the fourth page. You talk about typical communication. And I'm just going to read a paragraph here because these are things that for someone who isn't neurodivergent, they might not be thinking about all of the things that happen day to day that they do without even thinking about it. We don't necessarily think about how am I going to communicate today, that really could affect or change the way that someone feels in an organization. And you say here, the way that information is typically communicated, the neurotypical way, will not land well or work for many neurodivergent people, particularly those with autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. It is down to neurotypical people, the majority who run organizations on the whole, to change the way they communicate for the benefit of everyone. And so when we think about that, especially considering there's an opportunity in this episode to really provide some tactical skills for people to really be able to create a more inclusive organization or environment for folks, what are some ways that they can communicate or think about communicate or add it to their repertoire, so to speak, so that they are, even if there isn't someone neurodivergent, maybe there will be in the future, so that they, when they communicate, they're taking those practices in stride and being more inclusive in the way that they are communicating.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the first point that needs to be considered is plain and simple language. In the UK, we have a plain English campaign, which has been running for many years now, over 20 years. and it's designed to help communicators to outlay information in a way that everyone can understand. I think the typical language is at the level of a 14 or 15-year-old can understand it and absorb it and interpret it. So no flowery language, nothing too complex. Keep it simple is the
Mhm.
first thing. And then also look at how you lay out your information. So if you're using text, there are some really simple tricks that you can use, not complicated at all. Avoid colored backgrounds, use bullet points, keep your
Mm.
sentences short, make sure the layout is visually easy to read. So don't cram loads of text into one small area, space everything out, use 1.5 or double spacing. That's what I do routinely in my emails. And it took me a while to realize what I was doing. And it's actually a way that I understand information. So I started to interpret that sort of knowledge as everyone else may
Interesting.
also benefit from having that, information laid out. But it's not just text. So the other thing is to remember different formats, different approaches to communication. So much reliance on email, written communication, but we
Mm.
have our access to so many different ways of communicating. Audio, as we're doing now, we're doing visual and audio with video and on this podcast.
Right.
um and you can also use different formats in terms of look and feel, design. There are so many different ways that you can communicate. It doesn't have to be written, but then again, it's interesting to note that, for example, ADHDers will benefit from written communication. They like everything to be written down, and I can allude to that too. It really resonates with me having everything written down. But
Hmm.
dyslexic people do not like written communication because they have a problem, a challenge typically with reading. Not all, but most do find reading challenging. So for them, spoken communication is better.
Right.
Audio, yeah, video, audio notes, voice notes, that kind of thing works really well for them. I'll tell you a story. The other day, it was actually this week, someone messaged me and said, "Oh, you must have forgotten about our meeting." And I was frantic. I went to my calendar because I hate letting people down. That's an ADHD thing too. We're people pleasers. So I went into
Mm.
my calendar, desperately checking for this invite. Couldn't find anything. There was nothing in my calendar. So I went back to the person and I said, "I don't have anything in my calendar. When we were supposed to meet?" And he said, "I sent you an email. I sent you an invite." This went back and forth for about 10 minutes. And then finally he said, "Look, here it is." So he forwarded it to me and I looked at it and it was an email. It was literally an email with the date and the time. And I said, "There's no way on God's earth that I would be able to look at that email whenever it was sent 4 weeks ago and then translate that into, I've got to meet with you today at one
Of
o'clock or
course.
whatever it was. I need an invite." And I just took it as read that everyone needs that. And I know neurotypical people also benefit from it, but he was really stunned as to why I would need that. So, yeah, it's considerations as simple as that that make the biggest difference.
That's really interesting, and I appreciate you sharing that because also I can say, I mean, if someone didn't send me an invite, it just simply will not happen. Like it just won't. You won't see me. Can't
So
count on
true.
me. Sorry. Calendarize everything, even taking my
Right,
vitamins. I
right,
calendarize. Like I have
right.
to. Otherwise, it's in one ear and right out the other in a
And the
matter
thing
of
is, for
seconds.
ADHDers, that's crucial. That is completely crucial. It's the
Mm,
be all and end all, really. And if you're working with someone who has ADHD and you're expecting them to come to a meeting when you haven't sent an invite, then that's just plain unfair because it's not never going to work.
hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it makes total sense. And, you know, I think also when we think about all that people have going on, I mean, we just have to assume that we can do so many things to just make things a little bit easier for people, reduce the friction where possible. And, I was thinking about some of what you've shared around the communications and how we really support people in our workplaces. And I've shared on the podcast before, and I think I shared with you also that my older sister has Down syndrome and she's not super high functioning. And of course, that is significantly different than someone who has ADHD, autism, or other neurodivergent diagnoses. But certainly growing up with a sibling who has special needs and required many different resources and support and a specific school that would enable her learning, I really do think about how many people might, when they hear the term neurodivergence or autism especially, they might think immediately to people who are very obviously, when in appearance, you know, uh, diagnosed with one or more of these diagnoses. And it's not always the case. I mean, we even see, like, my sister is not someone who would be able to work in a coffee shop, right? But
Right.
there are many people with other developmental disabilities or capabilities, as I'd like to say, who are able to do those things and may not appear to someone as having, a considerable diagnosis. The same goes with autism. Many people, as they hear this episode, if they've not encountered someone with autism or another type of diagnosis, they might only think about someone who stims or who has, a very specific, like maybe even a nonverbal attribute.
Yeah.
And I think it is important, and you mention it in your white paper, that there's masking and there are people who have not been diagnosed with these things who may appear to be neurotypical, potentially. And when we think about that in the workplace, I think it does allow us this reminder that we can't judge people by the way that they appear, by what we think that they are. The same, it really goes kind of for everything. But just because someone appears to be one way or is nonverbal, for example, doesn't mean that they don't have a whole host of thoughts and cognitive processes that are going on, right? I mean, we know this to be true, and I think we could talk about that alone for a very long time. But I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you specifically to, this reality that there are people who are undiagnosed, who mask, and also people who maybe are, by physical attribute, demonstratively different
Yeah.
from someone who's neurotypical. How do we best kind of navigate those relationships? I can imagine that for someone who is not typically surrounded by someone who is neurodivergent or has a, is not neurotypical, that it might be a little uncomfortable for them to know how to interact, or how to appropriately respect someone and understand what they need or what questions to ask. So, where does someone start with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as you've rightly said, it's a spectrum. So
Mm-hmm.
same with autism and ADHD, they're both spectrums. So you get differing levels of, of how they are affected of the condition that they have. So, for example, you do have masking, particularly in women and girls. They mask a lot. So my daughter was diagnosed very relatively late, 14, in comparison to other children. And my son was diagnosed at 10. So they're both autistic, but they are like night and day. There's no
Mm-hmm.
commonality between them at all. And you were saying earlier that, people may not have come across a neurodivergent person or an autistic person. Chances are they have, they just didn't realize it.
Right,
And if
right.
you were speaking to me without knowing that I had ADHD, even though I'm not formally diagnosed, I'm 99.9% certain I do. There's no way you'd be able to diagnose me from the way that I present, because I present in a neurotypical way. And even in the neurotypical population, there's neurodivergence. So, but if you have a group of neurotypical people who don't have autism and ADHD, there will still be different ways of learning, different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world. That's neurodiversity. And I think it's
Mm,
good to sort of categorize the two because they often get conflated. And neurodivergence relates to those specific conditions. So, yes, you're right. There are autistic people who can't speak. There are
mm-hmm.
autistic people who can't walk. There are
Mm-hmm.
autistic people who have learning disabilities, but the vast majority don't have any cognitive challenges at all. They are, most of them, I'd say at least the majority of them are able to learn. in a similar way to a neurotypical person and actually are a bit more academically competent than most neurotypical people. So they're very good at reading, very good with
Mm-hmm.
mathematics. Not everyone. I'm not going to tar everyone with the same brush, but I've met many autistic people who've been to university, have degrees, master's degrees, and also PhDs. And the reason is because they have this focus on one particular thing that they are interested in, and they can go deep, deep, deep dive into it. In autism, it's called monotropism. In ADHD, it's called hyperfocus. And what that does is enable you to go very deep into a topic over a considerable length of time, and that lends itself to academia completely. You know, if you're doing a research degree or a PhD, that's if you're interested in that, then you can go as deep as you like over, 3 or 4 years. So yes, it is a spectrum. There are people who can't work for, for many reasons, because they're not able to access the working environments. They cannot socially interact. It's very difficult for them to follow instructions. So yeah, what I always say, my starting point for organizations is people managers. I always call them the vanguards of the employee experience. If you're a person, manager, you're a supervisor in some capacity and you have a team, you have such an opportunity there, to understand each and every one that you manage deeply, on a one-to-one, personal basis. So you can say, this person likes to work in this way. I understand that they don't necessarily align with the way that I work, but we can mitigate those challenges just by understanding each other and, intervening where necessary. So the starting point is not HR, it's not policies and processes, it's the people manager. We put so much onus on them, but that's because they are,
Mm-hmm.
the first and last touch point.
Yeah, it's so true. And as you were sharing that, I was thinking about all of these opportunities when we do employ those who are neurodivergent, that we have a lot of opportunity talent wise because of some of these unique skills that do come along with these multiple diagnoses.
Exactly.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, there are so many famous people who've now revealed, that they are neurodivergent, and most of them are in the creative industries. There
mhm.
are many in tech too. So I think Bill Gates is one of them. I think he's said he's autistic. Will I Am has
Wow.
ADHD. Elon Musk, I
Wow.
think he's autistic.
Yeah, I think
Greta
that's right.
Thunberg, she's autistic. There's many, many people who are neurodivergent, and they are super creative, super innovative, and super productive. So yes, you're right. Can you imagine that untapped resource? You've got people in your organization who are neurodivergent, but they could be in the wrong job, or they might have a manager who
Right.
doesn't understand their way of working, and that's when the problem arises. I know for a fact that many ADHDers have lost their jobs or been put on
Mm,
PIPs, which are performance improvement plans, as we call them, because they have been seen to be incompetent or perceived as disorganized. But
mm.
actually, it's just the way that they work differently. And if you understand that, then you can mitigate those challenges by putting in place some interventions that benefit them and will help your team to, complete projects, on a timely basis. So it's all about awareness, it's all about understanding, and it's all about interventions, but the right interventions.
Right. I really appreciate what you've shared there. And, especially on the basis of PIPs and other performance elements. And when we think about the responsibility that people managers have, and for all of us maybe who are in HR or trying to get into HR, there's an opportunity there to really think about what the expectation is for people, and that it's okay to have the same level of performance expectation from an output standpoint, but that the journey just might look a little bit different. I mean,
Exactly.
when I think about like even my role today, I work in tech, and a big part of what we do, I mean, we're remote first, and I think that definitely sends a message as far as like what trust looks like in our organization, because you have to have a lot of trust and rely on your team to accomplish what's necessary to get the job done and move the needle forward, right? But I share that because when you have an organization that inherently says, I know that you can work whatever you need to, you're going to get the job done. You can work from home, you could work from France, you can work from Argentina,
Yeah,
as long as the job gets done, right? That's kind of the same thing that needs to be applied to really all employees, but especially those who are neurodivergent. It's like, okay, well, as long as you kind of get to that end result, whatever that performance result needs to be, maybe it's delivering on a project or, some other deadline, the road to get there doesn't have to be the same for everyone. And as a matter of fact, in most cases, when people have the flexibility to be creative about how they deliver on a result, you're going to get the best out of them anyway. And I
exactly.
do think, right? I think that people leaders have a real opportunity in just changing the way that they manage people.
Yeah, and it's this holding on tight to the past,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
sort of historical way of doing things. There's so many people who refuse to let that go, and it's not necessarily related to age, although having said that, younger people do seem to be more comfortable with the idea of remote working. But in the last 2 years, we've seen a real backlash against flexible
Mm,
working, remote working, working from home as they call it. But it doesn't necessarily need to be working from home. It could be working from a different environment, a different office, or a different location that also belongs to the company, but is more comfortable for the individual. So, for example, if you're autistic, having a fixed working space is really beneficial. So you come to the same place, you know what noise level you're going to get, you understand the light
mm,
that you're going to see, you understand, perhaps the smells that are going to pass your way. And those things are really important for autistic people. Whereas if you have a hot desking culture, where people
oh,
move
God.
around from one day to the next, that's an absolute nightmare for an
Yeah.
autistic person. And you really have to understand the impact of that. So many people managers might say, well, what's the issue? They're just sitting over there instead of sitting over there. But for them, it's much more than that. I can recommend a book to your listeners called The Reason I Jump. It's by a
Mm.
Japanese autistic boy. He wrote it when he was 13. I think he's a grown man
Wow.
now. But
Wow.
it's a bit childish because he was only 13 when he wrote it, but it
Sure.
really gives some serious insights into what it's like to be autistic, and the
Oh,
experience of being in pain. So, for example, if you do move an autistic person, sorry, autistic adult from one desk where they're used to another, that actually can result in physical pain. And
wow.
that's something that's very difficult for neurotypical people to understand. It took me a while to get my head around it. But once you understand that equals pain, then you know what the benefit is of leaving them where they are.
Wow. Wow, I had no idea. That's
Yeah.
really important information. And it does make me think about what might be a natural next question from someone, which would be, well, how do I know if someone is neurodivergent if they don't share? And of course, on the HR side of things, it's like people don't have to share what they're experiencing in order for us to understand or create a more inclusive environment. Certainly, people can share if they'd like to, but we know that there are discriminatory practices, unfortunately, still in businesses and organizations today. So, first of all, I do not encourage anyone to ask, are you autistic? Are you ADHD? Do you have ADHD? That is not what we ask people. And in many cases, especially in the United States, you cannot ask that question.
No.
But what would you say to someone who says, well, how do I know? How do I know if someone needs that? Is it that we need to just do these things as part of our everyday, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I was asked a similar one yesterday. So no, you don't have to disclose. And the same with the UK. You just simply don't have to say that you're neurodivergent, and they can't force you. Businesses can't force you to say you are. But the good
Right.
thing about disclosing is that there are interventions that you can get as a result of the disclosure, and that's in law. If you present a certificate from a doctor or a psychiatrist saying that you are diagnosed with autism or ADHD, that employer is honor bound, legally
Mm,
bound to provide you with those accommodations. So that's a good thing. But yes, of course, many people still don't disclose. But that's the wonderful thing about neuro-inclusion. This is why I love my job so much. My course, my program, everything I teach is around creating this neuro-inclusive approach to work, a neuro-inclusive culture. If you don't have it, then it's going to be a challenge for you. You have to have an environment which is conducive to being neuro-inclusive in the beginning. So, for example, if you're, I don't know, a company which is very different culturally to Google, then, you can't be Google. But, within your environment, you can create a culture if the leadership is willing to, which is still neuro inclusive. You don't have to be a Nike, or a Google or a Facebook or a Meta or anything like that. You can still create a neuro inclusive culture, which is aligned to your business and to your industry. So it's all about tailoring that approach,
Mm.
but understanding that neuro-inclusion is the starting point. If your culture is not, ready for creating an environment in which your neurodivergent employees and future talent can thrive, then it's never going to work.
That's amazing to reflect on, and it's I love that we are kind of coming back to the very beginning of this podcast, that it's, and it's really about what you do, and it's about driving neuro inclusion. And when we think about inclusivity, I mean, that is a huge part of it. And I really love that, when we can think about like ways that we create neuro inclusion, that it's not always about creating something different, but it's rather about adjusting the way in which we work today, or the things that already exist, in order to be more inclusive for those who require it and really need those interventions, as you've put it, in order to perform their best and have the best potential for their own happiness and engagement and success.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. It's all about creating an environment that works for not everyone. I'm not going to go down that road because you get people
sure.
saying, well, we can all benefit from it. But when you go down that road, then you lose the understanding of what it is to be
Right,
neurodivergent. It's not everyone that can benefit. It's neurodivergent, people
right.
that can benefit. So, for example, I don't mind hot desking. I keep using that example because many people would consider that to be not a problem or an innocuous, request. Move your desk, or change your usual meeting room. Do things a bit differently today. For most people, I guess they'd be okay with that. But for an autistic person, you're asking a lot of them, to change that position, even if it is just for one day. You're asking them for a lot. So if you understand
Mm,
that, then you know how to intervene in the right way. It's all about understanding. And this is why I wrote the white paper, to give people that baseline awareness of what it's like to be neurodivergent in the workplace.
right. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights and the research that you've done, and all of the expertise that you've brought to this podcast and to the listeners. I really appreciate it, and I'll link that book that you've suggested, as well as your information. But just to give you the opportunity, where can listeners connect with you if they want to learn more, or they need a consultant, maybe even for their own organizations, or want to connect?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. You can visit my website, which is wheretolookcoms.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me at Kate Isichei. DM me there, or you can reach me via my email, which is kateisichei at wheretolookcoms.co.uk. So any of those channels you'll reach me, no problem.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Really appreciate it, like I said,
Thank
and
you, Tracy.
I it was amazing to hear all of these insights.
Thank you so much.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.